Let's turn to our interview with Ron Paul, former congressman, and talk about the American power structure. We're joined by John Cohn.
Ron, there's an old statement I've read and heard about people saying in Congress, the banks never lose.
Well, I think that's a general statement. I think the big bankers never lose. But I think a little banker right now is losing a lot because a lot of little bankers are getting closed down. The big banks are gobbling them up. I don't think David Rockefeller is going to lose. I don't think he's going to be out selling apples or pushing pencils anytime soon. But a lot of bankers that are being wiped out at the state level are losing. But the big banking power structure seems to have control because they're on the inside and they have control of money and they know what policy is going to be down the road.
Can you specify this structure, you're talking about this power structure?
Well, the power structure basically is made up of a lot of very powerful business and corporate leaders in the country. And in particular, they have formed their organizations. They've been around for a good while, and they don't even hide it anymore. You know, the Trilateral Commission, as well as the Council of Foreign Relations. No matter which president, which party is in power, they will appoint to the major offices members of these committees, and they always have control of the Federal Reserve System. So the Wall Streeters, the big bankers, have inside information as far as what is happening and what's going on. And control over money is pretty significant because if you can control money, you're really controlling 1/2 of every single transaction. So that is a tremendous amount of power. But it doesn't look like we're going to have any independence. They say the Federal Reserve is independent, but that's a bunch of nonsense. The protection that the founders gave us to try to keep us from this happening never authorized a central bank, and they were very strict in the writing of the Constitution to limit the power of Congress to the minting of gold coins, to allowing only gold and silver to be legal tender, and prohibiting the printing of paper money. All those things we have failed to follow. That's why we have a central bank with a paper money system and a lot of inflation, high interest rates, and a very, very shaky economy. So I would say that if we would have followed the advice of the Founding Fathers and not allowed this power structure, this group of elitist bankers and industrialists to get control not only of the banking system and the monetary system, but really our foreign policy and our government. I wrote a little speech and gave a speech right before I left Congress, and I said I don't think the members of Congress really know how little effect they have in controlling things. Really, and that means that the Congress itself doesn't have much control. The people doesn't have much they don't have much to say about it either. The control of overall policy is really in the hands of a very small number of people who control all the administrations, all the appointments to cabinets, and certainly all the appointments to the Federal Reserve.
So that shows we have a single-party political system in the United States, just maybe split in two a little bit, but there's really no difference.
It's a single party, and if you look at the obstacles put in our way as libertarians to get on ballots, it's an outrage because we have to spend more than 1/3 of our energies and our monies just to apply to get on state ballots, and this distracts us. Some states it's almost impossible to get on. They say, and I have not personally investigated every law around the world, but they say that we are one of the toughest countries in the world to get a new party system. And the American people have been conditioned that it's great to have two parties. We don't want to be like Italy where there's all these choices. We want to limit our choices. It's easier that way.
And we don't want to be like the Soviet Union where there's only one party.
Yeah, that's right. So they have two. But if policies never change, what's the difference? So we do have one party. There's policies never change. You know, if there would have been a difference, maybe under the Republicans we would have had a closer to a balanced budget, but the deficits were worse with the Republicans. But foreign policy, the policy of intervention, subsidizing communism, and helping rich allies, that always continues, Republicans or Democrats. It was the same policy, Republican or Democrat, that supported wars like Korea and Vietnam, and the CIA operations and the FBI. All these operations are endorsed by the other two parties. But for that reason, what do? They get control of the funding as well. The other two parties get over $100 million handed to them. You know, not too long ago, we had the two conventions on national television, Republican and Democratic convention. And the American people didn't watch. They should have. They paid for it. They paid $9 million. We as citizens were forced to pay to run those conventions, $9 million apiece, and therefore they get all this exposure, making it, again, very difficult for an option, a third option, to be heard. It's very hard to get our message out. But the control is there, whether it's in the political control or the banking control or in government policy control in the administrations.
I want to touch, if I may, just on your comment a moment ago about the departing speech that you left with your colleagues in Congress. You were there for 4 terms, and I think are aware of the general level of awareness of your colleagues in Congress at that time. Do they really not know that all of this is going on, that the power structure is there, unseen, but really manipulating the strings?
Most of them don't know. Most of them are suspicious that the problems are more serious than they would never, ever admit publicly, but they don't understand the policies. I've had a lot of members on the banking committee come up and ask me questions. How does the Federal Reserve System work? What are special drawing rights? What is the IMF? And they'll do that quietly because they haven't really studied it. So most of them are naive, but very much aware that there's some serious problems. But if you get somebody at the head of a committee that's been around for 30 years or so, I think that they know very much what's happening. They're very much attuned to what's happening, and I don't think they get that far. I don't think they get to head of a committee unless they've more or less been accepted, by the power structure.
I did a study, or just a quick look, a few years ago after reading the Joint Economic Report of the Joint Economic Committee in Congress. And reading it, it looked like it came right out of the Trilateral Commission. It looked all the little buzzwords that the Trilateral Commission reports had, all the things that the Trilateral Commission wanted. So I looked to see if in the memberships of organizations of these congressmen and senators, and sure enough, almost every one of them are a member of the Trilateral Commission or the Bilderberger or Council on Foreign Relations.
I can remember having a conversation with Barbara Conable one day.
Yes, he's a biggie in the power structure.
And he was complaining about, there's people always complaining about me belonging to the Trilateral Commission. He was complaining to me, and lo and behold, it was Barbara Conable, but as soon as he resigned from Congress, where did he end up? The head of the World Bank. Right. I left Congress. I studied the banking system. I understand something about the money. They haven't called me yet for one of those appointments. No. I've been waiting at the telephone, waiting for them to appoint me.
Well, John, you've studied a lot on this banking industry structure, and it's not only interlocked here, but there are international interlocks, aren't there?
Yes, there are, and the ties with the foreign banking interests. The people that settled this country left. Of course, Europe came over here and settled down, and almost immediately the powers that be in the European continent and the money circles were reaching out those tentacles to gain control of the new country here. And that struggle has continued. We see it, and who shall control our currency? They struggled back between Jefferson. As a matter of fact, I have a quote from Jefferson that I think is very pertinent to our discussion here. If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied. So he warned us that far ago, and here we are, and what he said is coming true.
Yes, and his side certainly won the fight back then. They got the right position in the Constitution. They had the debate over the money issue. The hard money people won. The Federalists lost. The Hamiltonians lost. But then subsequently it's been downhill, and certainly in this century. It never happens at one time. It isn't all or nothing.
They keep chipping away, yes.
Even though we got our central bank in 1913, it wasn't the total destruction of the system. It literally took from 1913 to 1971 to open up the floodgates. But it was in 71 that the last linkage to gold occurred. Of course, in the 60s, there was still some linkage to silver. But since 71, all you have to do is look at the economic record of spending and deficits and all the economic problems and interest rates and all the price increases. I mean, it's just been totally out of control. And Then, even in 1980, there was another law that increased tremendously the power of the Federal Reserve.
Credit unions and the savings loans.
Yeah, the most significant increase in power to the Federal Reserve System occurred since 1913 was in 1980, further enhancing and getting more power into the Federal Reserve. This was a time when they introduced this idea that we could use anything, or the Federal Reserve could use anything as an asset to collateralize our Federal Reserve note. See, in the old days, you'd have gold and silver as collateral to issue a note, which isn't too bad. You know, it's collateral, and it would restrict the monetary authorities, and it would be a certificate. You know, it would be a guaranteed certificate. But it was then that they changed it to say that you could use any asset, even a foreign bond. So it's true now that you can use, and they have, used foreign bonds, they put them in the Federal Reserve, and that's the backing. That's the collateral for our Federal Reserve note. That's how strong our currency is. You wonder how the currency works. It doesn't deserve to work. And someday the people are going to wake up and realize the money's worthless, and that's when you're going to have runaway inflation. Today we just have gradual, steady inflation, depreciation of the money, causing a lot of harm and suffering. But one day the country's going to wake up, and there's going to be a catastrophe.
I want to focus on the Federal Reserve itself for a moment, in that I wonder, what percentage of the people know that the Federal Reserve is not really a part of the government, a privately owned corporation, and who owns that, the Federal Reserve? Well, do you have a comment on that?
Well, I think very few people understand how it works because the members of Congress weren't really very much aware of it. But I think it's a little bit worse than just saying it's private. If it were just private, they'd have to live within the laws of the land of fraud, and they would have to be a public corporation. And if there's a public corporation, you have a right to know what your corporation is doing if you own stock.
And be audited.
Here it's secret, but where do they get their power? Is it the power of the marketplace that creates this corporation? No, they, in addition to being very secretive, have their authorization, their creation from government. So the government creates them, and they create a special thing. So it's much worse than just being a private corporation. It is a very secretive, private, government-ordained corporation that has the power to counterfeit money. So it's very, very unique and much worse than just being private. It's the secrecy of it and the power that it gets through government legislation that makes it so evil.
Now, you were the ranking Republican on the House Banking Committee for a while.
On one of the subcommittees, but not on the entire committee.
And do I understand correctly that members of Congress can't even go to the Fed meetings?
That's right. I was very interested in the issue, and I was on 3 subcommittees, 2 being on coinage and domestic monetary policy subcommittee. But I could not go to a meeting. I couldn't get an audit. I couldn't even check the books. And they're the ones who create the money. Yet I felt like I was elected to be responsible to the people, and I would be inquisitive and looking into these things. Their attitude is, when you need to know, or when the people need to know, we'll tell you. They're in charge, and we're just on the outside looking in, rather than the people being in charge of the government, sending me or somebody else as their congressman to control the bureaucrats. But it's turned upside down. They have control, and they allow us to know what we want and what they think we should know.
Now, what does the Federal Reserve System actually do? I have so many people say, I see this, and the Federal Reserve, I don't know what the Federal Reserve Bank does, and why is it so significant?
Well, it does several things. One of the benign things it does, and in some ways efficiently, and that is they exchange checks. They're an exchange bureau, but that could be done very easily privately. The real evil that they do is they create money and credit. If the federal government runs up a debt, and they tend to have a habit of doing this, and Congress is, run by Republicans and Democrats, so they all spend money, they run up the debt. Of course, when they spend, they have to tax us. If they can't tax enough, then they have to borrow. And if they can't borrow enough, then they have one other option. They can tax and borrow, inflate. Inflate. The most important thing to remember is inflating is not the prices. The prices go up after the money is inflated, and the money loses its value. So the Fed is designed to accommodate the politician in a very secretive manner. The politicians spend the money because the special interests come and say, we want this, we want this. The politician gets reelected, so he's rewarded, and the tax becomes an indirect tax. Instead of going directly to the people, what the Federal Reserve does is they can take a Treasury bill, accept the Treasury bill, which now is just a mere computer entry. They accept the Treasury bill of $10 billion, and they give Treasury $10 billion in their checking accounts. Where did the Federal Reserve get the money? right out of thin air, right from heaven. They create the money, they put it in the checking account, and the Treasury spends it. And then that means that the people who got that money immediately get to spend it, and it has value. But as it circulates in the economy, the value of the purchasing power of the money goes down, and you have prices going up. The bad part about this is not everybody suffers equally.